Welcome to the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast. It's the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. Today's episode is exciting. It's a live recording as part of CANIE Climate Action Week. There's a lot of firsts. This is the first time we're doing a Climate Action Week in April. This is the first time we're doing a live podcast recording. This is the first time hosting a full episode together with Kelly. Lots of firsts, super exciting. Not the first time we're having Simone on our episodes. So that's not a first, which is even better actually in this case. So a little bit about CANIE Climate Action Week. This event, this podcast that you're listening to, is the second event in a full week of events. I was earlier at the Oceania meeting, earlier today, yesterday, whenever this is. There's lots of really exciting stuff coming up. There's the CANIE Accord sessions. There's sessions about getting ready and implementing climate action within your sort of international office. There's regional chapter meetings. There's another podcast recording. Big week, exciting stuff. So really happy to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm also happy to be here. I'm Kelly Davis. I'll be one of your CANIE co-hosts for today. I've been working with and volunteering for CANIE for about a year now, really hands-on. So I'm very happy to be here with CJ, my co-host.
Yes, thank you. And I am CJ Tremblay. I am a founding member of CANIE and the first host of the CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast. And so happy to see how it's grown and changed and Kelly and the team have taken forward. So thank you so much for being here. Yeah. Thanks, Kel.
All right. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, this is a live podcast recording. So the way that we're going to go about it today is we're going to have about 30 to 40 minutes where CJ and I are going to engage in conversation with Simone. We've got a bunch of questions prepared about an article that recently came out. And then we're going to leave some time at the end for you to ask your questions. So keep in mind that if you decide to unmute and ask your question, you will be recorded. You will be on a podcast, which is really cool. If that's not really your thing, you are welcome to put your questions in the chat and we will get to as many as possible. So that's the benefit of being in a live podcast session. You get to engage with the guest in real time, which is really special. So today we're going to talk specifically about this study, which was really the first study to empirically test the effectiveness of collaborative online international learning, or COIL, using control groups. So there's a lot to dig in here today. And yeah, thank you again, Simone, for being here with us today.
It's great to be here and thank you for inviting me.
Super happy to have you. And Kelly, I'll let you take over.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much to CANIE Climate Action Week sponsor, Altea Global Cooperative. Altea Global is a worker cooperative providing consulting services to decarbonize international education by focusing on equity-centered climate action. Services include professional development training on climate justice, emissions assessment of your international operations, communication, messaging, and policy writing support, and other projects as needed. And of course, Altea is a proud signatory of the CANIE Accord, which if you don't know much about that, you can head to our website, CANIE.org. And learn more about CANIE Accord signatories. Altea's website is altea.global. That's ALETHEA.global. And we'll link to the website also in the show notes when this is published. And as always, listeners of this podcast will know we're very grateful to the University of Auckland in New Zealand for being a CANIE Climate Dialogues podcast sponsor. They've been with us since just after the inception of the podcast, and we are super happy to have and grateful to have their ongoing support. So thank you very much to the University of Auckland.
Well, it's on. This is big news to everyone listening. Big news, friends. You may or may not have heard, but it looks like COIL works. And I want to get into this a little bit, talk about some context, because there's been an increase in the profile of COIL since the start of the pandemic. We had Simone and Keiko Ikeda on a previous episode a couple years ago to go over the basics. And we had a really great conversation. It was valuable. I learned a lot, and we'll link to that episode as well in the chat and in the show notes. And as international education practitioners, our sector and those who work within it, you guys listening at home, joining us in this episode today, we all care deeply about developing global citizens and intercultural competencies. I also think our sector cares a lot about sustainability and climate action. We see SDGs increasingly woven into institutions and organizations. Though our sector is heavily reliant on flying, which is one of the most emissions intensive activities humans can undertake. Particularly, that is true in international exchanges and mobility programs. So there are also people who are deeply passionate about internationalization who advocate about really having to have an intercultural experience in person. And that's a really interesting question. And because we often hear it has to be done in person, this is the only way to develop intercultural competencies. There's really not been a ton of information about that. Like, does COIL actually work? And COIL is a relatively new method, and the literature and research on COIL is still emerging. So before we jump into this episode any further, live podcast, we want to hear from the people who are joining us today. We do have a poll. We've got a poll question for you, and we want to ask you, are you or is anyone at your institution currently using COIL? Yes, no, but you plan to. No, you don't have any plans to yet, as far as you know, and not applicable. So if you don't do student exchanges, you don't have, it might be a service provider, that's not applicable to you. So that's good to know. And while you're answering this, or after you've answered this, if you could share in the poll, sort of in the chat, sort of what your barriers have been or are, that'll be really helpful to shape our conversation a little bit later. So we'll give everybody just a couple seconds, and then B, I might ask you to wrap up the poll when you feel like you've got a good number you can be confident in.
That's great. We've got 83% reporting, and we actually have a really high level of people who have said yes, they are using COIL. So we've got 65%. There are 15% of respondents saying that they do not currently use COIL, but they do plan to, and 5% who say they do not and they do not plan to. For the remaining 15%, we have not applicable. So thanks everyone for sharing your responses there in the poll.
Yeah, that's really great information and nice to see. It sounds like we've got some service providers in the room, so that's great. So thank you for answering and for sharing. And as we continue, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat, any barriers that you might have or have experienced. So you might be using COIL or other people might be using COIL. But mainly, we would love to hear what you've maybe come up against to being able to use it more, even if you are using it. So please feel free to do that, and we'll sort of keep an eye on those and engage over the course of today's podcast. Okay, so now we know where everyone who is joining us live is and what the barriers are, and we can sort of start to get into that. But I just want to say that I was so excited on when today's guest announced that this research came out on Twitter. It was like January 24th, very, very late at night, my time, because it came out in the morning in the UK. And I remember thinking like, oh, cool. I haven't seen research specifically on this, but I'm no expert, so I probably missed it. And then I was reading the research and saw sort of this very specific excerpt, which was, there are few experimental studies investigating the effectiveness of COIL, and to our knowledge, no studies have been carried out that make the use of a control group to assess the effect of COIL on intercultural competence development, which was, I was glad to hear that I didn't miss anything. That was awesome. But also, that means it's really important and groundbreaking that there's a space that we needed to make space to talk about it. So that is why Simone is here. Simone Hackett is a returning guest to the podcast. She has over 15 years of experience in the field of internationalization of education as an educator, program manager, researcher. She's one of the leading experts on COIL and has been developing and teaching COIL courses since 2012. And since 2020, she's been carrying out empirical research using control conditions to test the effectiveness of COIL. Simone regularly presents internationally on topics related to internationalization and COIL, and we are very lucky to have her today. We are very glad you're here. Thank you for joining the pod. How's it going, Simone?
Thank you for having me, CJ. It's wonderful to be here, to hear your voice, to see you. You always make me feel so comfortable on the show, so thank you for that. I'm doing good. It's spring here in the Netherlands. When I look out the window, it's still a little bit gray, but the weather forecast is telling us that the sun is going to come this week at some point. So I'm hoping for that. And other than that, yeah, doing pretty good.
Love to hear it. That's awesome. And I like to think that that's like indicative of things are just going to keep getting better. Love that for all of us. And I love that you're here. It's so exciting because the last time we had you on the pod, you sort of alluded to this research and initiating it. So it was about 2 years ago. And so I'm really excited to get into it. So I know that Kelly had a burning question before we dive deep into the study.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, and granted, I'm coming from my kind of perspective is I was working in study abroad during COVID. So I saw, COIL was suddenly everywhere. People had obviously been working on it before then, but everybody was talking about it. And I'm no longer a practitioner. I've since gone back to studying. So I really haven't clearly been in those spaces based on kind of our poll results. I haven't been in the spaces where people are talking about COIL. And to me, it seems like the chatter has kind of died down, but maybe that's a misperception. So my question is really, are people still talking about it? Is there more interest in COIL? Or because what we have been seeing is kind of the resurgence of physical international mobility, is COIL not talked about as much? What's kind of the dynamic there?
Yeah, no, I think it's really everything has exploded since COVID. So prior to COVID, people were interested. They thought it was an innovative practice, but yeah, some were engaging with it, but it wasn't to the extent it is now. But then COVID, when everybody went online, educators saw the potential of online platforms. We have Microsoft Teams now with a lot of functions on it, other platforms as well. So it's getting easier and easier to connect with other educators and connect students as well online. So it hasn't died down. It's actually the opposite of that. What we see is that it's becoming more institutionalized, centralized in universities. So they're placing COIL at central level to offer resources and facilities for lecturers. We also see different platforms popping up. COIL Connect is another one, which is being set up by John Rubin. And it's a platform where loads of universities can log in and register that they're active with COIL and what courses they want to COIL. And it's a matching service for universities to be able to find each other in different disciplines. We also see national funding initiatives. So here in the Netherlands, we have a national funding initiative. So if lecturers are interested in developing COIL courses, they can apply for funding and they will receive 15,000 euros in terms of FTE, which will help them, set up their COIL course and get going with it and teach it as well. We also see the Erasmus Plus blended intensive programs, which have been set up. And these are also offering funding possibilities for universities as well, educators as well. So it's definitely not died down. Of course, students are traveling again, and we're going back to normal in that case. But because the realization there of the potential of COIL, it's being implemented more systematically, perhaps. Not in all universities, of course, but in a lot of universities. So I wouldn't say it's died down. I think it's becoming maybe even the gold standard of internationalization at home now as well. So that would be my answer to that question.
Beautiful. That is really interesting, and I'm heartened to see that it continues to make advancements. My questions you sort of answered it, was like, what is, you talked a lot about different advancements that have happened, but if you could pinpoint to one that gives you the most optimism about the future possibilities of COIL, what is it that you find is the biggest leap that's happened in the last 2 years?
I think it's definitely the number of people who are interested in COIL now and who are actively engaging with it and implementing with the universities. Before, it was just a small few groups of people, groups of universities that were, active with it, and now that's completely changed. Also with the research now, because I started my research journey with COIL 3 years ago, even longer, 4 years ago, and now I see more and more research being produced all of the time now. So that's really advancing the field as well, because we're figuring out, okay, does it work? How does it work? How can we improve it? So that's really exciting to see that happening, and the quality of research as well as improving. So yeah, there will be. And of course, what I mentioned already, the initiatives to support and facilitate educators, because of course, COIL, it is, I mean, it's not, it takes time to develop a COIL course. Sometimes it can be vulnerable as well, because you're relying on your partner to run this course. So having, you know, your university central level or your leadership supporting COIL, offering resources and facilitation to lecturers is key in this too. So I would like to see more of that. I think that's where we need to develop as well. And I think Pete already mentioned this too in the chat there. Yes, that would be the area for more work to be done.
Perfect. And thank you for sort of alluding to the chat. One of the main obstacles that was alluded to is, you know, having academics find and commit the time needed for starting up a COIL collaboration. Lots of support for that comment. Another one around from Kevin, also a guest on the podcast previously, is the capacity of faculty members to facilitate effectively across cultures in the online space. Lots of support for that comment as well. And so I think as we move through this conversation, understanding those obstacles, we'll refer back to them as often as possible and sort of hope to resolve them. Perfect, resolve them. We're just going to solve all of them today in the next 40 minutes. Okay, so that's ambitious, but what's exciting about this study is that there hadn't been that many like data points about it specifically working before your study. You alluded in your paper about analysis, but there wasn't really a lot of like data points. So we're going to jump right in with the big question. This is the Climate Action Week after all. And then we're going to get into like the details a little bit and unpacking. But if I had to ask you one question, it would be, is COIL a solution in the face of a climate crisis? Or maybe like in what context can it be a solution to the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't claim, yes, it's a solution to the climate crisis, but it can help in assisting in finding a solution. Because of course, it has been said that it can be an alternative to flying abroad. How I see it, I don't think that like it's the poor man's choice compared to physical mobility. I do think that COIL is a teaching method. That's a basic method in internationalizing your curriculum. So I don't see it as like you can do a COIL course instead of doing a physical mobility. I see it as it should be part of the core curriculum. And in that sense, then, one is that you can use it to help students talk about different climate topics. It's very much based on curriculum content and also intercultural competence development. So you can include these. It could be from engineering, it could be neuroscience. They could talk about these key topics on how to solve climate crisis problems or climate problems through the curriculum content and through developing intercultural through this process, developing intercultural competencies as well. I'm not sure if it's really ethical that we should be sending our students abroad. I mean, they go abroad themselves. I don't know if we should be including that in our as an opportunity for our students now. But of course, that's quite radical to say that, but I do think COIL is an alternative method to help us develop intercultural competencies, to help us internationalize our program, and we should be kind of thinking about that a little bit more. And I know I will get a lot of, opposition to saying that it is a replacement. It is an alternative to studying or to flying abroad. So that's what I think, how it can help in this crisis we're going through.
Thank you for making that statement. I think it's important, and I mean, I don't think this is the venue where you're going to get a lot of opposition. I think everyone believes in developing intercultural, globally conscious students. I think that people who are in internationalization for the right reasons are passionate about developing sort of the global mindset in students and the global mindset to solve big global problems. And we're in the face of a climate crisis. So, I think that that's a very real piece that we have to face. And it's the reality of kind of the questions we have to ask ourselves. Yeah. So that's exciting. So thank you for saying that.
And I mean, I also hear the argument that it can be, it can be a way, if you implement COIL, it can trigger students' minds and, optimism or enthusiasm for going abroad as well. I also don't really agree with that either. I don't think it should be used as a tool to say, oh, if you do a COIL, yeah, the next step can be going abroad. I don't see it like that. I see it as a teaching method with the learning outcome to help students develop intercultural competencies. And it should be like a basic 101 internationalization within the core curriculum of your program.
So with that in mind, Simone, what was the specific reasoning that was driving you to undertake this study in particular? Were you hearing people say they wanted to move to COIL or move it forward, but they were also kind of skeptical, and so there was a question there that you were trying to address? Why did you take the time to conduct this study?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had been working on COIL for quite a long time, and I saw that, my students were learning from it. I saw that they were getting a lot out of it, but I didn't really have evidence to know for sure if they were developing intercultural competencies or not. And when I start looking at the literature that was available, I kind of just saw, either best practices or single case studies, and not really, empirical scientific evidence. So that came from my own curiosity that I said, I want to know for sure, are they learning? So that was one reason. And then the other reason, the design of this study is really testing the effectiveness of COIL. Does it work or does it not work? So that's interesting from a policy point of view as well, to show, okay, yes, it works. Yes, we should be implementing it. And or it could have, the results could have also come out, which I'll talk about later, that it doesn't work, and that we need to, we think that COIL is, the gold standard now, so we're implementing it all over the place, but actually it doesn't work. It doesn't help students develop intercultural competency. So we need to have this knowledge to be sure that we're offering our students quality education, and there actually are. It does have the intended effect that we think it has. So that's the reason. That's the reason why I decided to do this study, and several other studies that we're working on as well.
Yeah, it's always better to have this sort of empirical evidence than making decision based on vibes or opinions. So love that for the field, and thank you for your contribution to that. So now we've spent a lot of time talking about the why and sort of the background and context, but just straight evidence, top level summary, the highlights, if you will, of the results of your research. That's what people are here for.
Yes. So before I go straight into the results, I'm not sure if everybody's read the paper or not, but I will just briefly explain the design so that it's easier to understand the results. So we had 4 groups of students. So 2 from the United States and 2 from the Netherlands. What we did with these groups, we matched 2 of them. So one Dutch group with one US group, and they COILed together. That was the experimental group. And the 2 other groups, the Dutch one and the US one, they just worked with students within their own classes. So they didn't have that COIL experience, and they were the control groups. So all 4 groups, they had the same assignments, the same tasks. They worked online together on the same day for the same amount of time. But the only difference was the experimental groups worked with each other. They were COILing. So what we saw, we did a pre-post measure. So we collected data before the intervention, before the course, and at the end of the course. And we wanted to see whether COIL works or not. So we wanted to test to see whether there was an increase in intercultural competence after the COIL experience. And afterwards, when we collected the post data and we analyzed it, what we saw was that we saw an effect with the US group. So we looked at the gain scores from the pre to the post, and we saw a bigger difference for the US experimental group compared to the control group. And this difference was significant, which means that COIL works, that it's effective for the US students. It was effective. But a surprising result that we got with the Dutch students, or the students that were based in the Netherlands, was that both the experimental group and the control group increased in intercultural competence, and the control group even increased a little bit more than the experimental group. That difference wasn't significant, but the reason for this was because the students in the Netherlands were not all Dutch. The program that they were following was the course that they were following was part of an international minor, and so it was taught in English and had an international orientation to it. They also had a cultural communication course on it, and there were also international students following this. So the Dutch group was not really Dutch. It was a mix of international students and Dutch students. So that's why we saw an increase in the control group. We didn't see the same effect as we saw with the US group, because these students in the control group, they were Dutch students and international students collaborating together. So that's where they were getting their international input from. And they were also following this international orientated minor, which had the cultural communication course in it. But this is, and for the US students, they were all US citizens. Of course, they have different backgrounds, but they were all US citizens. They were from State University, New York, Brockport. So that's not New York City, it's upstate New York. So it's not a metropolitan city. And so this experience for them was a shock. They didn't know that they were going to get this COIL course. They just thought they were going to follow the standard project, and then suddenly they were landed with the COIL course, and this was a big surprise for them. So the effect for them was much bigger than with the Dutch group of students, or the Dutch and international group of students. So, but this is a very interesting result, because not only can we see that COIL works for specific types of students, but we also see that other internationalization at home activities work too. So collaborating with international students at home, and also a cultural communication course, an international orientated course, also has an effect. So, but of course we need to research those activities more to be sure that students are learning from these inputs rather than something else. But that is a very interesting results to support internationalization at home, as opposed to traveling abroad for an international experience. So yes.
And we'll come back a bit later to kind of touch on that piece again, the Dutch group, or the Dutch university students, we might say. But before that, can you tell us a little bit about how you went about measuring intercultural competences? There's a number of ways that you might be able to do that, but what method did you take?
Yeah, I mean, there are many different tools out there to measure and assess intercultural competence. And also in the design of a study, you can take different ways to assess or measure intercultural competence. What we did, because we carry out a mixed method design study, we used a questionnaire, and in the questionnaire, we chose two tools: the Cultural Intelligence Scale, the CQS, and the Multicultural Personality Questionnaire. And we included those in our questionnaire. We also asked the students to complete reflection reports at the end of the course, and we also did focus groups at the end of the course. And to analyze the focus groups and the reflection reports, we made a coding frame based on the two instruments, the CQS and the MPQ, and we analyzed the textual data using these coding frames. Of course, maybe a limitation of this study is that it is self-report, so the students are self-reporting within the questionnaires, and also in the reflection reporting in the focus group. So you don't they are saying, yeah, you're not seeing directly what's happening in the online sessions, because they're just reporting themselves in the questionnaires. But of course we have the control groups to measure for that. In the future, we have made recordings of online sessions, collaborative online sessions, and we're going to observe these to see what actually happens in the sessions and how students learn in these sessions. And then that might give us more insight into what's happening within COIL and how we can improve it and understand it more. Yeah, so that answers the question.
Awesome. Sorry, I was like nerding out just listening to you and just thinking back on the study as I researched it. Now, I know you talked about the limitations, but there's some like truly valuable results here. And I'm wondering if you can share how we can interpret those results and sort of turn them into actions, the climate action week, for the purposes of climate action. Like, where do you see these specific results being most relevant in taking climate action within an institution?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned this already, but it's really important for policy, because now we have, of course, this study. I mean, I really call for people to repeat this study, to replicate the study, so that we definitely know, this is just one study, but so we definitely know that COIL works. But it is really important for policy, because now we really have evidence to show, okay, COIL works. It helps students develop intercultural competency. So it's I won't say, I know I'll get some slack for this, but maybe it's not so necessary to encourage our students to fly abroad. Because we do have this alternative which should be implemented within the curriculum. So I really think that's kind of the number one relevance of these results for showing evidence, providing evidence that it works and that we should implement it. And yeah, of course, yeah. As I said, with the US group, we saw that there was an effect there. So that for maybe thinking about what types of students, what groups of students is COIL most beneficial, perhaps ones that don't have other international opportunities at their universities, don't have international orientated minors, or don't have international students within their program, that they might get the most out of COIL compared to students who are already following an international program. And yes, the other results, that internationalization at home activities also help students develop intercultural competencies and should be given more value and attention within university programs.
Right. And if I'm understanding correctly, just if it is the case that you're looking at changing policy, it's because you're looking at changing sort of results. And if the things that you're measuring is how can an international education office internationalize, and what you're measuring is actually not the number of students coming and going, but rather the number of students who've been internationalized, have experienced that international piece of education, that's a valuable application of that work.
Yeah, totally.
Because policy.
Yeah. I mean, of course, having this evidence is what policymakers need to make policy. So that's why such a study like this, although you have advocates for qualitative data and really understanding what students do and how students learn, but having these hard facts to say, okay, it works, that's what's needed if you want to make changes as well.
And you've touched on how you've not just touched on, but very explicitly explained that the group of students in the US were gaining kind of, let's say, a larger change in terms of the benefit. But even in terms of the group of students who are in the Netherlands, I mean, what is the potential behind COIL for just increasing the intercultural competencies for students? And what maybe is there opportunity there? Are there methods to help these students increase more? Is that something that we should be looking at as well?
Because we didn't see the same effect with the students in the Netherlands compared to the US students.
So with the students in the Netherlands, I mean, the same impact wasn't there, but we should still be focusing on them, and maybe is there room to kind of see how we can further grow intercultural competency with students who already have a higher level of it?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, like with the US students, it came as a big surprise to them. And with the students in the Netherlands, they were already signing up for this international orientated course. So it was kind of, and we went at the pre-survey, we already saw the difference between the students in the Netherlands and the students in the US, that I'll say Dutch students, but they weren't all Dutch. They scored higher on the pre-survey compared to the students in the US. So they were already more interculturally competent than the US students. So that's why we also looked at the two groups separately as well, because they weren't comparable. But I've carried out two other control studies since this one. And what we see is we did the next study after this one that we worked on was intensifying the collaboration between the students. So now we had 3 Dutch students work with 3 American students in the COIL session. But now what we did is we had 2 Dutch students work with 1 American student in one team, and 2 American students and 1 Dutch student work in the other team. So the collaboration was more intense. They needed each other more to complete the assignments. And we saw in this study that actually the Dutch students their intercultural competence increased more compared to the US students. And what this shows me, well, what this could be an implication, is that the Dutch students, they want more collaboration. They want deeper, more meaningful collaboration with the American students, and they get more out of that. So that could be a way to look at, okay, if we have these students who already have this intercultural, international mindset, we have to, give them a little bit more, bring it to the next level. And intensify the collaboration. So that could be a way, you can still COIL with them, but just do it. And, you could COIL 101, COIL 102 to make it and bringing it up a notch each time. Yeah. And of course, the other internationalization at home activities, which we mentioned as well.
It's really great that there's already other experiments being done. And so the body of work, just as you are pointing out, needs to increase, and you're on it. What are some of the takeaways for practitioners from this study who potentially, are working on COIL or plan to work with COIL? And what maybe are some of the takeaways in terms of them taking action when it comes to thinking about also the climate related implications of using COIL?
Yeah, and I mentioned this a little bit too. I mean, of course, we mentioned the policy, the evidence that they can show their leadership, that it works, that it's valuable to include this, to use this teaching method within your teaching and learning. But also to include, because COIL is really that's the difference between virtual exchange and COIL. Virtual exchange is the umbrella term, and it's not a teaching method, but it's an umbrella term. And under this umbrella term falls the teaching method COIL. And what you can use COIL for is it's based on curriculum content learning. That can be from engineering to neuroscience, to nursing, to sociology, and also intercultural competence development. And as I said, you can include the way you design, you have the flexibility there to design the assignments, to have these collaborative and intercultural learning sessions. You can also include opportunities for students to talk about climate topics and how to approach their discipline, if it's engineering or something like that, how to approach their topic and think about, solutions for the climate crisis as well, because that's where the change can happen with educating our students and using our platform as educators to influence this process as well.
Thank you for that. And I also just you've talked a lot about policy, and I love policy. I think it's super important, but there's another P word that is very important that I think that this study helps, and it's priorities. And we heard in the chat earlier that there are common barriers, really seems to be about, capacity and time. And these are pieces that tend to be aligned with priorities, right? So when there's not enough time, or there's not enough resources, there's not enough capacity, it is directly aligned because it is or is not a priority. And what I think that your study and research, and it's like Kelly mentioned, super excited to hear that there's more, and the people in the chat are very excited that there's more research coming, that it does help advance this. And in terms of action, it's nice for our listeners to be able to grab the link either from the chat or from the show notes, to be able to sort of take this to move this forward in terms of priorities, and to create sort of that policy alignment, a lot of those strategic documents, and having sort of all of the really critical data behind it. So thank you for answering all of our questions. I know there's some questions in the chat, so I wanted to bring that to people's attention and sort of get your thoughts. Nicolene, please forgive me if I said that incorrectly, asked, how important is it that teachers can really guide the developments during the COIL activity in order for the learning process of the students to take place?
Yeah, so what I see within COIL is that a lot of the research or the evidence that's available from from collaborative learning, so collaborative learning in the physical classroom as well, has been a little bit neglected in the literature and also in the practice as well. But there's a whole array of resources and knowledge out there which you can use in your COIL courses for creating these learning opportunities within the design of the COIL environment or the COIL assignments. she asked like how important it is that teachers can really guide the development. Most of that happens before students actually start participating in the course, because the two teachers or even more than two teachers get together, they design this course, these tasks for their students, and it should be really taught out. And it takes quite a bit of time to design it and think it out, to create these opportunities for curriculum content learning and for intercultural content learning as well, and set them up. You can create scripts for them for each online session of what they're supposed to do, and what questions they are supposed to ask each other, what feedback they're supposed to give each other, and that kind of thing. But that's all done even before they start the course. And of course, they run into problems during the course, one group doesn't submit their work on time or something like that. And that's the point where the educator is the facilitator for it, says, okay, try a different approach, or try this or try that. And it's amazing how easy that can be, just to step in and say, okay, you could try this approach or try that approach, and then the problem is solved. So of course it is designing a lot before the course begins in the instructional design part of it, and then also facilitating the learning process during the course, and just being a guide, not being a teacher, but a guide to offer, solutions for different approaches.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. To the people who are joining us for this live session, I would ask, we are going to be taking questions. So if anyone has any thoughts they'd like to share, or any questions they'd like to ask, please use that raise hand function. In the meantime, I will ask a question that I just had curiosities about while I was reading it. And I know you're very scientific and researchy, but was there anything that surprised you? Like when you were, like something that surprised you when you were going through it, or doing sort of that analysis piece, or through like the nitty gritty of the work?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about my other studies and that there's things that surprise me there. But with this particular study, yeah, I mean, it was surprising that the control group that we saw, that they also, the Dutch control group, I mean, that they also increased in intercultural competence, because I thought that, like, considering that the Dutch experimental group also, were following the international orientated course, had all those other inputs too, and the COIL, that they would have increased even more, but that wasn't the case. So that's kind of interesting, because now you wonder, like, okay, why didn't they increase much more compared to the control group? And it could be for several reasons. It could be because, the personality. So within collaborating groups, the personality is really important. If you have, only, more reserved people or introverted people within one group, this can really impact the dynamics of the communication. Or you have students who don't really take the leadership role, then that really affects the learning process as well. So that's something else I'm looking at in our current studies, is looking at personality types and how that influences group dynamics, and of course the learning and intercultural competence development. So that was one thing. And other possibilities could also be within this particular result, like it could be just it could be just the smaller number of a sample, maybe having a much larger sample would give us a different result as well. Because with us, we only had, like, I think it was like 33 in one group and 26 in another group. So having a much larger sample would also give you different results. So those kind of things would be something that you need to consider if repeating this study. And I would really call for people to replicate this study. I would be really interested to see what results they get if they complete a study or redo a study like this one.
Simone, I don't know if we have any early career researchers on this in this session right now, but maybe we have some who end up listening to this as a podcast. Would you have any advice for them if they want to get involved in this kind of research? If you're calling for more and more of this research, how can people kind of get into this area of work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great for educators to evaluate what they're doing. So if they are carrying out a COIL course, it's interesting for them, it's an intrinsic motivation as well to see, and that you can combine it with intercultural competence and also the curriculum content as well to see what your students are learning. So yeah, read our study and see what tools we've used, repeat it if you want. You can do it. I do see a lot of these single case research studies, and the only problem with that is if you don't have a control group, you never know for sure if it's just students that are giving socially desirable answers. They got this experience, so they think, oh yeah, we better say that we learned something from it, or it could be the teacher's bias as well. So you really have to have that control group to measure any positive or negative findings, or use observational data. So you can record the online sessions, of course with the student's permission, to see what's happening in these online sessions. How are they communicating, and of course use the systematic ways to evaluate that as well. So I think just start with it. You could start with a single case study, start evaluating pre-post or reflection reports, and then advance on to, if you have the facilities, to include a control group in your study as well.
Thank you. And we have a question from Robin Shields in the chat. Are there other outcomes that you would like to look at in relation to intercultural?
Yeah, I just mentioned the curriculum content, outcomes as well. I also think, it depends on what tools you measure or what tools you use to measure intercultural competence. Sometimes I think it could be, depending on the tools, you could be missing certain things as well what students are learning. And maybe the questions within the tools are missing the other elements, such as their attitudes changing, to certain topics. Maybe if you include cultural questions, exchange questions about, for example, sustainability, that's not included in an intercultural competence measurement tool. So you might be missing things like that. So including some way to evaluate those kind of learning elements would be important in it too. And I'm just reading what Nicolene is writing as well. Maybe that will be called virtual exchange rather than COIL. So there's a lot of talk around the different terminology as well with virtual exchange and COIL. And that's something that I'm working on with some researchers as well, is to distinguish the COIL method compared to virtual exchange. Because if we want to research this method, we need to define what it is. And if you look at virtual exchange, there's many different initiatives that fall under virtual exchange. It could be remote internships. It can be, paid MOOC-like courses. All these different types of things that can fall under virtual exchange. And you can't evaluate COIL if we just call it virtual exchange. You also can't make claims that virtual exchange works, because we don't know if it works, because there's so many different initiatives. So it's really important to distinguish COIL from virtual exchange. Virtual exchange is the umbrella term, and COIL is a teaching and learning method, which falls under virtual exchange. It includes the co-design element of two educators coming together to develop their course, the assignments, and also students coming together to learn curriculum content and developing intercultural competencies through this experience. So it's important to clarify that if you're a researcher, if you want to measure the effectiveness of the different practices.
Not unrelated to that, and to bring into Kelly's looking out for the early career researchers, Philippa in the chat mentioned that Erasmus blended intensive programs can be a great model to research, since they include both online and in-person collaborative international learning, and some students take part online only. And she specifically would like to see the differences that brings. So ideas for those early career researchers to look at. So thank you for everyone for sharing in the chat. Any other questions out there?
We've got one more from Kevin.
There it is, Kevin.
So the question is, some faculty use COIL or online with parts of their course, but not the entire module, maybe 40% or so. How important is the level of engagement or the time that's allocated for engagement between the student?
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about, when I just mentioned there about distinguishing COIL and also identifying key characteristics of COIL. And with other researchers, we are coming up with a list, and we would say like at least 4 collaborative sessions, and these sessions will be a minimum of 45 minutes. So that's kind of what you're looking at. Of course, I know that educators design COIL courses in different ways, but this will be, I would say this is a minimum for, for the students to build up a relationship with each other, and to get to know each other, to get to know, within their own team and also the international team as well. I would try to spread those 4 sessions over, a period of like 6 to 8 weeks as well. So I think that's, what you're looking at, and try to sync the online sessions within school hours if possible. I see that works better. I know some educators have the students meet outside class time, but sometimes things can get muddled up and they have different activities going on. So it's I would advise to try and control it a little bit. And if you can, of course, it depends on the time zones, to try and sync the classes, the collaborative sessions, at least 45 minutes, 4 online sessions minimum, spread across, 6 to 8 weeks. And then you can, of course, depending on your course, see how that fits in with your assessment and your curriculum.
Amazing. Kevin, thank you for your comment there, your question, and I will agree with you. Thank you very much, Simone. It is always such a pleasure to have you on the pod. We are coming to the end of the hour. Time flies when you are having fun. I just want to thank you so much, Simone, for being here. Thank you to our listeners listening after the fact, to all the people who showed up today to be a part of this session. It was the first time ever doing this, and it was a blast. Thank you to our volunteers for helping make sure that this runs smoothly. We've got some other stuff happening during Climate Action Week this week. Specifically, there are other sessions on the Accord and sort of taking action and sort of getting started. But I would encourage you also to join your regional meetings, because they are a great opportunity to get involved. And specifically to learn about the working groups. There are loads of working groups in CANIE, but I will also say, might be a little bit biased, one of the most fun ones to be a part of is the podcast working group. And it was such a pleasure as a sort of former host to come back for today's episode. But the podcast is now in sort of fresh hands, and Kelly and the team are part of that. So I will sort of let Kelly tell you a little bit about that. If you have ideas, you saw it in the chat. We want to hear them. This is for international educators by international sort of education practitioners. So thank you so much. And Kelly, I'll throw it over to you to wrap
Thank you.
up.
Yes. So if you want to get involved with the podcast, that is fantastic. It can be just by contributing your ideas and generating content. You can help us kind of get the word out about it. You can host if you want to, but that scares some people, so you don't have to host. It is really fun though. So definitely, if you want to come join us, we have 2 working group meetings coming up. They're the same day, and they are at different times to make sure we collect all of the time zones. So they are on May 2nd, and the first one will be at 8 a.m. Central European time, or 4 in the afternoon if you're based in Sydney, Australia. And then the second one will be later in that day. I'm based in Europe, which is why I'm using the Central European time. So it'll be 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, or it'll be 5 in the afternoon Central European time. So definitely please get involved. It's super fun and engaging. I see podcasts as a means of being able to share research, share knowledge, share practitioner ideas and learnings and best practices. But there's a number of things that we kind of share on the podcast. So any idea is welcome. But thanks everyone for being here today. This has also been a fantastic session. I've enjoyed myself as well. Simone, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for being here today. I hope you enjoy the rest of CANIE Climate Action Week.
Thanks so much, everyone.